Angela, we hear a lot of people talking about working with concepts in language teaching and learning. What does this approach mean, and how is it different to what we already do?
Look, I think that perhaps there is some work on concepts, but I think that there's also a little bit of fear around concepts and some kind of sense that perhaps we can do concepts later when the language is more sophisticated, but we will do baby topics in the here and now. There is an issue that no doubt comes to the mind of teachers, and that is the one about how do we actually do this in the language that we are teaching and learning. And you've reflected about that.
Yeah, I've been thinking about, and trying in my own work to work more conceptually. And what I've found works for me, at least, is working through from the concept and sometimes considering the sub-concepts or the dimensions of that, and then taking a particular line and really trying to then think about where would I find this concept manifested through text.
Yes.
And so my hook in is then through the layer of text.
Yes.
And so I begin to collect snippets of text around this, a brochure here or an email there, or whatever the texts are where this concept reveals itself in some way. And so then I collect the text around that, and I look for then the next layer is the language layer of, well, what's the linguistic content around this? And it might be some specialised terminology, it might be particular forms around structures, it might be particular questions and so on, and it might be the textual features itself, so the genre might actually be the key learning. But so I look for the patterns, and then it's kind of, I call it grounding the concept, because if not, there can be a very high level conceptually that isn't possible in the language. And so those two things have to align for me to feel like the concept is actually teachable, that we will actually touch that concept, and then working through a unit or a program and actually bringing it back to reflection at the end. So starting with a sense of what do I want them to learn about this concept or understand in relation to this concept, and then working through the text and so on in the usual kinds of ways, and coming back at the end to reflect on the concept as well as language and so on, to actually really pick up, have they actually developed some new thinking conceptually, not just linguistically, and obviously the two are related.
Well, in some work that we're doing currently in curriculum development, we've explored many different ways, and this is, in fact, this project happens to be primary. But look, we've done at least 10 different projects in our centre with teachers looking at actually how to do this. And you're quite right, it's often through stimulus texts, but that needs to be understood in the widest possible way. Sometimes it's a YouTube clip. Sometimes it's just, we do cascading images, just so that the students see a whole host of images. For example, on house and home, different kinds, the high-rise to in China, the mud caves as a home. And so a real cascade of images to actually show the students and give that impression of variation and seeing how different it can be. And then there's a lot of language work associated with that. Some of that language work is more routine in nature, And so be it, because we still have to do the language building work that is absolutely necessary. And sometimes the ways of doing that are more mundane, although we try to stretch the imagination as much as we can. So there are flashcards and there are other kinds of images and, a bit of repetition and so on, as one would routinely do. But it is placed in this larger context. And then the learning experiences themselves are scaffolded. These routine language getting and practicing elements are there, but they are there as scaffolds towards the larger experience that is more conceptually driven. It means selecting different kinds of resources, linguistic and otherwise. We use a lot of texts written by native speakers, often children as well as adults. So a lot of material that's there actually written by children, the children of families that we know, in order to get child or language that is closer to the world of the child. And then, but they are scaffolds to the larger learning. With the reflections for this particular primary project, some of the times it is in English, but again, I will repeat, I will rather have some English meshed with the target language in order to get the deeper learning than to say it is too difficult to get there in the target language, so we won't do that part at all. Because for my money, it is the engagement at the conceptual level that actually brings the students in, that it is exploring these issues around being in the world almost philosophically that brings children in. It's not by chance that there is the compulsory teaching of philosophy in France as part of a regular part of the curriculum, because children, young people want to explore these big ideas about who we are in the world. And we have to scaffold the language to get them there, rather than dumb down what we do because of that gap that we're trying to bridge in language.
And I think it really only needs to be a single question that sometimes can get at that deeper learning.
Absolutely.
It's not that we're saying, we need to be doing, 100% in English.
Absolutely not, heaven forbid.
But it's a question of the dose. It just needs to be one or two little prompts.
And oftentimes it is just one question and it changes everything. The work on concepts, we will acknowledge, takes a while. We have worked with lots and lots of teachers, and they have told us, and we can see that we kind of reach a level of understanding, and then suddenly they go away and try to do it, and it falls apart somewhat. And we want to acknowledge that, because we're not just saying implement this as a strategy. It really is a way of thinking about the whole process of language teaching and learning. And it's changing your stance in relation to language teaching and learning. And that is a much bigger task than just implementing some easy little strategy and then off we go. So we would rather that you do a lot of experimentation and recognise that that experimentation itself is going to be worthwhile as you try to expand the language teaching and learning beyond description. We want students to be able to actively work with and in language. We want them to experience it. We want them, as Joe was saying this morning, put them into the shoes of actually being in another culture. And so we need to try and unpack how students themselves see these ideas and work with their conceptions to actually come to a better understanding of ourselves and our students as people.